people, and that's really important when you look at how much bigger their budget is than ours. Foreign affairs is like tiny, so I'm sure they wish one of our Latin American analysts could just retire and they wouldn't replace us, but you can't shift away. Most of them is where it is in the 80s.
Yeah.
When it was the hottest thing
Sure.
to hit the planet.
I would say
but-
that.
It's nice to see a number of faces that I've seen before. Particularly like to point out one of our fellows coming back, Brian Pukal, who has been working on some very interesting issues regarding U.S.-Mexico security cooperation. And it was a delight to have him here, over the past year. And a number of other collaborators and colleagues here in the room. But I'd like to begin by thanking Aubrey Fox and the Institute for Economics and Peace for coming to us. I guess I can't remember how many months ago it was now, but sitting down with us and explaining what the Mexico Peace Index project is all about, explaining as well what the Global Peace Index is and how Mexico fits into that. And we had a very good conversation. The project intrigued me, and I thought it would be great to have a presentation of the results here in Washington. One of the things that I like about this project in particular, and for those of you who don't have a copy, there's a copy outside on the table, and of course it's available online. One of the things that I particularly like about this project is that, first of all, it's a peace index, and very often these kind of reports try to engage in sensationalism, playing up the numbers of homicides, violence, war, etc. Now, this is not just a question of semantics, in my opinion. I mean, I think that one of the things that we have to really look at is, if we want to help the cause of peace in Mexico, is you have to study the conditions for peace. And very often, I think that we have become obsessed with quantifying levels of violence, not just in Mexico, but around the world, rather than really trying to look for the solutions. So unlike quantitative examinations of homicides or kidnappings, violent crimes, etc., this focuses on a broader definition of what constitutes a peaceful society. And one of the sections that I enjoyed most about this report, and I urge you to look at it, is the section on the correlates of peace between pages 26 and 31. And maybe our commentators are going to talk about that in a little while. This can't hope to be exhaustive. Obviously, they can't look at all of the different factors that contribute to peace. But I found that it ties in nicely with some of the work that we've done here at the Wilson Center, and so I was particularly attracted to it. The relationship, for example, between education and violence, which is something that we have speculated about and we've begun to examine. There was some very nice work done by one of our scholars, Matthew Ingram, earlier on this year, which was published in a book called Resilient Communities, which again is available outside for you, which argues that there is a very, very positive relationship between improving education systems and lowering the rates of violence or raising the levels of peace in a society. There's another part of the correlates of peace section in this report, which I found intriguing as well, which was about population density and urbanization, which suggests that more urbanized states are more likely to be violent. This is an intriguing one because, in fact, a lot of the assumptions that we've been working under are that, in fact, the more urbanized an area, the easier it is for public authorities to exercise control. So, in fact, having widely dispersed populations may mean that it's much more difficult for states and the federal authorities to actually establish control over an area. So that's intriguing. I'd like to see how that plays out. And one of the disclaimers, which I'm sure Michelle is going to make in a second, is that a lot of the information here, the data is from 2010, and so we need to see how these play forward. Lastly, I'd like to point out the importance of looking at this report in the international context. The table on page 34 is enlightening here, and in particular, two different statistics or comparisons. Mexico versus the world in terms of deaths from organized violence, and Mexico versus the rest of the world and the rest of the region in terms of homicides per 100,000. And they're two radically different figures. And so, as all of us in this room are very well aware, a lot of the focus in the international media over the last 8 years or so has been on the number of homicides taking place in Mexico from organized crime and violence. But if you look at the homicide rate in Mexico in general, compared to the rest of Latin America, Mexico comes off very, very favorably indeed. So I just urge you to take a look at that. The importance of understanding peace and violence at the level of society is one of the things that comes out very clearly for me from this report, and I hope that we can get into that in the discussion after the presentations, and the importance of involving society in the effort. As I said, our recent book, Resilient Communities, strongly emphasizes that approach, And we hope to be able to collaborate more with the Institute for Economics and Peace on relevant studies that might help their work going forward. If you look at the back of the report, there's a very nice section on expert contributions. And some of the questions that many of us have had about, does, for example, violence impact upon competitiveness? There's a nice little piece written by the folks from, or Eduardo Clark from IMCO in Mexico City, which directly addresses that question. And I think that's a very nice touch in terms of balancing out the report. It's not just from the folks at the Institute for Economics and Peace. They have other experts being brought in there. Without any further ado, because you're not here to listen to me, you're here to listen to three brilliant women, and we were remarking before the event that it's not often that in an event on violence in Mexico that you have three women who are presenting their views. Sometimes it's difficult to look around and find one woman on a panel. We've got three brilliant women here. I was delighted to be able to go straight to my Rolodex. Not literally, of course, because they don't exist anymore, do they? But go to my Rolodex and think the three people that I'd love to have on this panel, well, the woman who really wrote the report, and then these two women who have worked with us so incredibly well over the past, I don't know how many years, but 5 or 6 years, longer than you care to remember, who have been great supporters of ours, Claire Silke and Maureen Meyer. So let me introduce you to Michelle Breslauer, who is the Director for the Americas at the Institute for Economics and Peace. I'm not going to read out her bio. You have it in front of you on the paper. Claire Silke, Specialist in Latin American Affairs, Congressional Research Service. Thank you, Claire, for being here. And Maureen Meyer, Senior Associate for Mexico and Migrant Rights at the Washington Office on Latin America. Michelle, I'll turn the microphone over to you.
Thank you. And give me just 1 second to pull up these slides. In the meantime, while this is happening, thank you for having me here, and my colleague Aubrey Fox, who's sitting in the back. So I didn't put Building Peace in Mexico as the title of mine. I put Measuring Peace in Mexico because I think that starts to frame what I want to talk about today, which is IEP's work around the Mexico Peace Index. And just to start quickly, who is the Institute for Economics and Peace? We are a not-for-profit think tank headquartered in Sydney, Australia, with offices in New York, in Oxford, and with some representation now in Mexico City as well. And our aim is to try to put metrics behind peace in order to better understand trends in violence and peacefulness, to understand the drivers of peace, and to look at the economic impact of peace. I actually have this. So first of all, I think it's important to think about how we define peace, because that's really going to be the basis for some of these indices that we've put together and some of our analysis. Obviously, peace has a different meaning to every person, and there are different levels of societal peace, institutional peace, personal peace. But for the definitions that we're using to try to measure peace, we're looking at negative peace and positive peace. So negative peace we call the absence of violence or the absence of fear of violence. And that's the measure that we're using for the peace indices, for the Global Peace Index, which I'll tell you about in a moment, for the Mexico Peace Index. But obviously, negative peace isn't the whole story. It's really a measure of what we don't want. So we also try to look at positive peace. And positive peace is really the attitudes, institutions, and structures that can help decrease violence and move society towards more sustainable peace building. And so that's what we do want. And that definition of peace is reflected in two different ways in the work that we're doing, and I'll get into that in a moment. So just to start off where we come from, to get into the Mexico Peace Index is the Global Peace Index. This is something that the Institute for Economics and Peace has been producing since 2007. We rank 162 countries, 99% of the population. And in the Global Peace Index, we look at 22 indicators of peace. We're looking at both internal factors and external factors, everything from perceptions of criminality and homicide rates to level of military spending. And this is meant to give a bit of a holistic understanding of the state of peace in the world. And this is a measure of that negative peace, absence of violence or absence of fear of violence. We work with the Economist Intelligence Unit for the collection of data on that index, and we also work with an expert panel who peer reviews, who looks through the methodology and the weightings each year. And the reason that I just want to quickly explain what the GPI is because that forms the conceptual basis for our work around national peace indices, of which Mexico is one. So at the end of 2013, we released a Mexico Peace Index looking at the 32 states of Mexico. And this is an attempt to start to go deeper into these measurements within a country, and then hopefully as our work progresses, we can go down to more of a community level as well. But the Mexico Peace Index is based off of only 7 indicators. So it's looking at internal levels. And how did we put this together? We took the Global Peace Index as a base. We assembled an expert panel in Mexico representing different think tanks, IMCO, as Duncan mentioned, representatives from academic institutions like CIDE, Mexico Evalúa, government institutions to review the data sources, to review the methodology, and to help us apply this to the cultural context of Mexico. There are 7 indicators. The closer to 1 is more peaceful, the closer to 5 is less peaceful. They're weighted. And this is to give a bit of a balance to the index, to make sure that we are presenting the data in the most accurate way possible. And one thing to note is that with this work, we were able to take it back to 2003. So we're really looking at about a 10-year period in the index. Now, something that Duncan mentioned that I think is really important to underscore is that one of the reasons that we put together this index is because violence in itself is inherently multidimensional. Taking one indicator like homicide rates does not give an accurate reflection of violence, particularly in a country like Mexico. So we can't just take one metric. We need to combine a number of metrics because it starts to make a very complex idea simple to understand. And that's what we hope to do with these indices, is to take something as multidimensional and complex as peace and present it in a more simple way for people. And Mexico is a really good example because violence varies widely within the country. And so we take these 7 indicators. When we did a US Peace Index and we looked at the states of the US, we only had 5. But here in our organized crime indicator, we're also including drug-related crimes, extortions, kidnappings, and that reflects the particular context of Mexico, that kidnapping is a form of violence that we've seen to be prevalent, and that's not the case, let's say, in the United States. So the 7 indicators are meant to give a more holistic view of the nature of violence and to build this internal measure. And I want to point out that the data that we're using for these indicators is publicly available data. We take it from government sources. All of the methodology is in the report, so you can look that up. And we try to adjust for underreporting here by using victimization surveys. So we go to great lengths to try to make sure that the data is the most accurate that it can be, and that we make up for some of those areas of underreporting. So just to take a quick look at the results of the index, here you see the map. And I think less important is who's at the very top, Campeche, who's at the very bottom, Morelos, but more this great spread and differential that you see within the country. Red is less peaceful, green is more peaceful on this map. So it's really, look at the big differentials that you see there. And that's reflected in the data as well. You see violent crime ranging from 8,000 in the least peaceful states to less than 500, and that's per capita. Firearm violence ranges greatly as well, particularly around in states where there's higher levels of cartel activity. Organized crime is unevenly distributed. This we are pretty much aware of. But even justice system and impunity rates. Some states have impunity rates above 93%. So there's really a big spread here, and that's important to look at. Looking at the overall trend of the Mexico Peace Index, we saw that there was a great deterioration and then a slight improvement in the last 2 years. And as Duncan mentioned, the last 2 years for us was really 2010 to 2012. And it should be noted that we hope to put out the next peace index, Mexico Peace Index, next year, and then we'll be able to bring it through 2013 and for some indicators through parts of 2014. So from 2003 to 2010, we saw a 30% deterioration in the overall score, and from 2010 to 2012, a 7% improvement. But we also saw a greater inequality in violence. So exactly what I referenced before on the map is that we do see this inequality in geographic inequality in levels of violence. Looking at the particular indicators really briefly, the MPI score improved by 7%, and this is through falling violent crime, weapons, offenses from organized crime, and incarceration rates. We think from anecdotal evidence that this is something that will continue in the next edition of the index. But the homicide trend clearly has been driving a lot of these levels, and here you see the great spike. Homicides rose by 37% from 2007 to 2012, and that has been widely reported in the news and has been a driver of a lot of the violence in Mexico and has been directly related to ongoing violence with drug trafficking organizations and organized crime. But looking regionally at that homicide trend, it's not the case that it's the same in every area. So as you can imagine, homicides impacted the north of the country much more extremely than they did the other regions. When we look at changes in peace, and this map is a little difficult to see, the blue represent the states that have improved. The red and orange, the ones that have deteriorated. And I put this up because I think it's most important to see that there are states that are improving in their levels of peacefulness. And there are forms of violence and peace that aren't necessarily related to organized crime and the drug war that need to be addressed, but that there can be small changes in peacefulness over longer periods of time. And that's something that's important to remember. Oaxaca was the largest improver in that, and here you see some of the indicators, homicide and weapons crime for Oaxaca compared to the national average. So now looking at some of the challenges to peace that we identified through this report, where do we see some of these areas of impact? One is firearm trafficking. This was a study that came out of the Transborder Institute at University of San Diego with David Shirk's organization. And they were looking at estimating the number of illegal firearms brought into Mexico. And you can see that the number of firearms here has increased greatly over the last decade. And it's almost 3 times higher in the period of 2010 to 2012 than it was from 97 to 99. So this is an issue that obviously transcends the policy borders for Mexico. It's international. It reflects decisions made in the United States as well, but it's one area of impact where we do see, a lot of impact. Another area is around incarceration and judicial efficiency. So as I mentioned, impunity rates in some states are higher than 90%. Prisons are overcrowded. These are areas to focus on when we're looking at policy change and at ongoing trends. Clearly in Mexico, overpopulated justice system and dealing with such a dramatic spike in violence in such a short period of time, this is something that is understandable in a sense. A criminal justice system is difficult to have to proceed with efficiently when there is such an increase in violence. Another area is looking at policing funding and trust and the levels of federal funding going to state police. And what we saw was that the states that had higher levels of funding coming from the federal government tended to have lower levels of underreporting for robbery and assault. And this was particularly important to try to bolster trust in the police. And we've seen that both at the global level and within Mexico, measures of corruption correlate very strongly with levels of peacefulness. So you can have small levels of corruption in a society that won't have much impact. But once it reaches a certain tipping point, it's going to have dramatic effects on levels of peacefulness, and particularly trust in institutions. And we've seen that trust in the police has a significant impact on peacefulness. Do you trust the police to be providers? Do you feel safe in the streets when you're walking at night? And so these are touch points when we're looking at policy. And what we've seen here in Mexico is that when we look at Transparency International surveys, 90% of respondents in Mexico feel that the police are corrupt or extremely corrupt. And this is an extremely high number. It's 40 percentage points higher than the global average. So even the respondents in the US, many of them feel that the police or institutions are corrupt, but nowhere near the level of 90%. And so this brings us to what Duncan was talking about before, looking at the correlates of peace and looking at positive peace. So what I described was negative peace, what we don't want, essentially, but then how do we better understand what are those informal and formal institutions that can help drive peace in a society? Globally, we've developed a framework called the Pillars of Peace. And the Pillars of Peace is an 8-part framework. It's integrated, and it's statistically derived. So we have about 9,000 data points in our database in Sydney. We correlate those against 8 years of the Global Peace Index, and we found that these broad areas are most strongly associated with peace. So we have things that are fairly self-intuitive, but we've done this empirical and statistical analysis to show that there is a relationship, and this sets the frame for thinking about peace building and how do we invest more long-term in institutions. These range from, you can see them here, sound business environment, equitable distribution of resources, and that goes from everything from not just income, but services, acceptance of the rights of others, good relations with neighbors, that's both community relations and relations between states, free flow of information, which access to the internet, journalistic freedom, freedom from fear of violence for journalists. High level of human capital is about youth development and education levels, low levels of corruption, which I mentioned before, well-functioning government, and I think I said sound business environment already. Now, when we do the National Peace Index, we want to try to see which one of these pillars, which one of these areas and socioeconomic indicators relate in that country. And in Mexico, it was actually quite difficult to look at the correlates of peace because when you have the drug war that we've been dealing with, it's really hard then to try to take the data and figure out which ones, how you see these relationships minus the drug war. But I'll tell you what we did find. And just to start with saying that when we look at Mexico and those pillars of peace, we see that there is a lot of potential in Mexico. And what I mean by that is that when we look at where Mexico places against a global average on these pillars, versus its levels of violence, there is a gap. So there is a potential, the institutions are stronger than the level of violence is reflecting. So if we look back at the last century of Mexican history, you didn't have these levels of violence. So there is the potential there institutionally, structurally, to advance in peace. And we see that some of the areas where Mexico is doing better on these pillars are around high levels of human capital. That's, again, I said educational attainment, distribution of resources, sound business environment. And I want to stress that this is against the global average. It's not against another Latin American neighbor or against the US. Areas where we see that Mexico is scoring particularly badly against the global average would be, for instance, free flow of information. When we see numbers of journalists killed, for instance, in Mexico, that's an area of concern. But then looking at the Mexico Peace Index, looking at the states and taking about 60 data sets that we correlated against the Mexico Peace Index, we saw that the factors most closely linked to peace were perceptions of insecurity, health, urbanization, education, and poverty. And I'll just go through those very quickly. Perceptions of insecurity. So this is showing really that people's perception of their own security in their state is matching the level of violence that we're recording in the Mexico Peace Index. And so it shows a strong relationship there, which is validating for the index, but also for the ideas around perception surveys and how to increase people's trust. Urbanization, as Duncan mentioned, more urbanized states tend to be more violent. So a focus for violence prevention on cities there could be particularly useful. Education and peace. So here, globally, we have a really strong relationship. We see that high school graduation rates in the United States correlate very strongly with the most peaceful states. At the international level, advancement through secondary school. In Mexico, prior to the drug war, there was a statistical link between education and outcomes and peace. And now that link is less strong. And that's the same as well for multidimensional poverty. But just to reinforce the point that that means that when we're looking at more forms of violence than just the violence coming out of the drug war, it is important to look at things like education and multidimensional poverty. And another reason that it's important to look at this work is looking at the economic impact. And Mexico is a really good example. And one of IEP, the Institute for Economic and Peace's key aims is to look at this economic impact. How do we understand not just the cost of violence, but the potential economic impact of peace? And it's our belief that if we can try to quantify that, if we can try to show not only to policymakers or to researchers, but also to business leaders, that peace has a financial value and not just a moral value, that this is something that will help propel people to work towards peace building as well. So we have a methodology to look at the economic impact of violence. We saw that for 2012, we estimated that in Mexico, it was about 4.4 trillion pesos. That's over 27% of Mexican GDP. And the way that this number is derived is looking at the direct costs of violence, so that's almost 4%, the indirect costs, which are around 12%, and then we add a multiplier, which is around 12%. So if we're looking at just the direct and indirect costs, the direct costs, if you're, for instance, you are assaulted, you're taken to the hospital, there is a direct cost for those services. The indirect cost is then you're in the hospital and you're not getting paid, you're not paying taxes, there's an indirect cost there. The multiplier reflects if we are putting more dollars into the economy, into more productive industries, it's going to have a flow-on effect. And so that's really representing a peace potential. And so if we were to invest in these areas like education or health, that it will have a flow-on effect instead of just investing in areas of violence containment, which tend to be less economically productive. So I want to be clear that when we are looking at that 27%, that includes the multiplier effect and the flow-on effects. Looking at the violence containment costs in Mexico, these are sort of the areas that we're costing out. Clearly, homicide is taking up the bulk of the costs here, but we are also looking at, as much as we can, impact of firearms, violent crime, insurance, fear, et cetera. And so when we take that 27% and we look at if all the states in Mexico had the same level of peace as Campeche, which I mentioned is the most peaceful, there would be an economic impact of 2.26 trillion pesos. That 20% reduction in violence and crime is equivalent to the amount required to organize the most recent World Cup in Brazil. And if we were to take the violence containment expenditure back to the level of 2003, it would be enough for Mexico to pay for the modernization of the entire public transport infrastructure. When we're looking also around the economics in Mexico, we see that the most peaceful states always have less violent containment spending. This is intuitive. We see it in the US as well. Louisiana, the least peaceful state in our US Peace Index, was $600 a person versus Maine, which is $250 a person. And that peace actually has a relationship too with economic performance. So the most peaceful states in 2003 tended on average to have higher GDP growth in 2011. And these were points that I think were picked up by the press extensively in Mexico. When we released the index, there was tremendous national coverage. We've continued to do presentations within states in Mexico that have gotten a fair amount of press. And what's interesting to see is the different areas that the press are choosing to focus on. I just put a few headlines here, but you can see that the economics tend to be a motivator for the media and a great message for advocacy and for civil society as well. Here you'll see that impunity rates were the headline for this paper. Now, that's an example of some of the media that we're getting. So it's one of the examples of the use of an index like this, is that it can drive the conversation. It can bring the media to the idea of peace. It presents peace in a more tangible way. We're trying to promote peace as a more tangible measure of progress. And I think that having that level of communication and publicity is particularly important for that, and to put pressure on policymakers to make change. We also try to encourage full interaction with this material. So we have interactive maps on our website, which I encourage you to go to. You can see all of our indices in Spanish, English, or French. You can look at all of the indicators by state. You can compare them. You can look at them over time. We make data sets available to researchers who are doing research in this area. So these are long-term projects that we hope to continue. And I just want to kind of close on a little bit about the so what of why this is important for us, and why we think an index is something that can have impact, and particularly this index. I think there are 3 points here. First of all, the link between economics and peace. We can no longer ignore the role of violence in society and the fact that violence has stagnated social and economic development, and that transcends borders. So starting to better understand what the impact is of violence is of tremendous importance. And Mexico is a great example of that. Looking at the progression of states from least to most peaceful, looking at the economic impact during this period of high levels of violence really illustrates that point. Secondly, what we see in the Mexico Peace Index is that everyday violence and interpersonal violence, homicides, what Mexicans are experiencing is also experienced around the world in different forms, but we see in the Global Peace Index homicides rising, particularly in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, terrorist levels rising. So it's no longer looking just at wars between countries and organized forms of violence. Now we should focus our attention on those levels of interpersonal violence. And I think that Mexico here provides an example where there are policy drivers right now that we can start to look at to understand how to tackle some of these. And if they are successful, then it could be a great example for other countries as well, which brings me to the final point, and I think one that I really hope to stress here is that there is a need not just to focus on immediate violence containment, but to invest in long-term peace-building structures. And that's a process that takes longer than 2 years. It's not something we'll see a difference in from 1 year to the next. But to try to refocus attention on peace-building efforts, on investing in the attitudes, institutions, and structures that help support greater peacefulness, and then looking at those and measuring them over 5 or 10 years is where we can see real change. And I think that what the MPI underscores is the need to continue to look at this and to understand what those drivers are and how we can invest in them and measure them. And there are a number of policy initiatives right now, as all of you are familiar with, in Mexico that I hope we can see some reflection in future editions of the index, and that we'll be able to then have better evidence for those types of policy change if they are successful. Thank you.
Michelle, thank you so much. And, I'd like to sort of repeat something you said, which is that it's worth going to the website to be able to see the interactive features of this and to be able to play around with it. I mean, it really is, it's very informative in that way, and I'm jealous of the fact that you guys have this capacity to do these visual things online, which is terrific. I'm going to turn the microphone over to Maureen Meyer right now. To Claire?
Yeah.
Claire.
That's okay. Okay, I'd like to thank the Wilson Center and IEP for inviting me here today to comment on this important and provocative report. Congratulations, first of all, on your report, and I really look forward to reading the follow-up next year. My comments today are my own, and they do not reflect the views of my employer, the Nonpartisan Congressional Research Service. I'm grateful to have the opportunity to discuss and assess how far Mexico has come in addressing long-standing problems in its criminal justice system and other areas that have been exacerbated by a dramatic spike in organized crime-related homicides that began around 2007, spiked, as she said, in 2010 to 2011, and have since begun to decrease. Due to time constraints, I will focus my comments on conditions in Mexico rather than focusing on the equally important external factors that have contributed to the insecurity that Mexico has experienced, including, as you mentioned, weapons trafficking from the United States and U.S. drug policies and changes in those policies and U.S. drug demand. Since the Peña Nieto administration took office in December 2012, international attention, or at least U.S. attention on Mexico, has shifted dramatically away from violence in the country's drug war and toward the country's enactment of a series of important economic reforms, and especially the historic energy reforms that were signed into law just last month. In the U.S. Congress, for example, Mexico is increasingly viewed as an important U.S. trade partner, a potential energy powerhouse, and a fellow country struggling to cope with illegal immigration and transmigration through its territory from the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, a much more unstable and violent subregion. Mexico is not seen, generally, in the Congress as a country that would be ranked by an organization like IEP as the second least peaceful country in Latin America, at least when this report came out. Just yesterday, a senior staffer asked me why President Peña Nieto is not more popular given the significance of the reforms that his government has enacted. I answered that many analysts suggest that he is not popular because growth in Mexico has stagnated in the last year or so, poverty remains elevated, and some types of crime have worsened, including kidnapping. These problems affect Mexicans on a day-to-day basis, whereas many of the reforms that the government has pushed and enacted, they do not promise to bring immediate prosperity. It's over several years that, particularly the energy reform, it's going to take a while to show results. I also pointed out that despite the progress Mexico has made in combating criminal groups and recent reductions in homicides, the country has continued to struggle with record levels of kidnapping, armed self-defense groups in certain states, and extremely high levels of impunity, corruption, and popular mistrust in law enforcement institutions, which have, in some cases, continued to commit acts of torture and other human rights violations. So thank you. Thank you for continuing to track these issues. I look forward to reading your follow-up, as I said. And, while I don't necessarily understand all of the methodology in the report, I did take some important salient points from it that I'd like to comment on. I think it's really interesting to look at how you have a map of the states and how they rank in 2012 or 2013, and how the security conditions varied at that time, and how those changes can change rather dramatically from one year to the next. For example, when you all did your rankings, the state of Mexico and Tamaulipas were sort of in the middle of the rankings, and even Michoacan was not that bad. And now those three states are facing serious violence problems. And so that's just within 2 years, things can change from one thing to another. And so I think as the two governments, for example, are trying to do things like foster educational exchanges, it's hard when the U.S. wants and Mexico wants to get more U.S. students to study in Mexico, but then if a state is fine and then it goes on the U.S. travel warning, it's really hard to, these two policies don't really match up. Our educational partnership desire, but then our travel warning, there's still kind of some obstacles there. I wonder whether your organization sees changes that have occurred among the states more as a result of changing dynamics among crime groups, or whether or not you see those changes as impacted by government efforts. I also found that while there is a variance by state, as Duncan has stated and you've said yourself, I'm encouraged that Mexico's overall peace score ranks below what it could be and what its level of development would suggest. When you talk to staffers and when you talk to policymakers about Mexico, it's much, much more hopeful, or at least I am, than how I am when I talk about Central America in terms of its ability to face these challenges. Mexico has the capacity. It's just a question more of political will and where you decide to put your resources. Do you back and do you have a sustained commitment to institutional reform? Do you have backing for the government or pressure for the government to do the right thing from civil society, from the business community? And also, do you have sustained support from the United States for, not just having them buy our helicopters and do border security and technology on their southern border, including their northern, but do you also have a commitment to funding judicial reform efforts and long-term programs that are not necessarily sexy, but they're very important for Mexico? I found it also very interesting. I just added this. When you have those circles of what's important and where Mexico is not ranked very well compared to the global average, when you have the free flow of information, and you mentioned the problem of journalists being killed and there being a lack of protection for those journalists. It's also interesting that when the government itself isn't producing good information and freely that information is not available to the public, it's been really frustrating to see, like, what's the number of the disappeared? Is it 20,000? Is it 7? Is it 12? Is it, where are the homicides? And people can say things like, I don't think the government is correct when they say that the violence has declined by this percentage, but I don't really know because nobody's tracking the data the data that this one institution produces is way off compared to the other. So a focus on data would help everyone in terms of like the government and us and everyone following this issue. So I like the way your study can be a conversation starter to encourage business elites to work and for peace. I like the way you said that. That actually struck me because I thought that while violence has had economic costs for the country, you mentioned effects on tourism, investment in some areas, government spending decisions. I thought that was interesting, whether or not you invest in police or in education, and lost income. I feel like those costs have been more borne out by small and medium-sized businesses that have been extorted versus international multinationals that are used to working in much worse conditions. And for example, in the energy industry, big international oil companies, they work in Nigeria, so it may not bother them, but small companies that are thinking about whether or not to go over the border in Texas, it's kind of, a big concern. And so I feel like whether it's domestic companies or international companies, it seems like both for the regular people are more affected by this than the elites, and then small companies more than large. And so I wonder whether, when the elites have been affected by the violence, as in Monterey, the business community really organized and worked with the government and to pressure the government, and things got better. And so I wonder whether, you feel like that's a model that, other parts of the country, what if they're not as wealthy? What if they don't have people that are listening or elites that have been affected, especially in Mexico City, or, I don't know if it's made it there as it did in Colombia. And I'll let Maureen talk. I was going to say a little bit about, how I think it's interesting that the homicides and the violent crime have overwhelmed the justice institutions, and mention that increased spending does not always make better results, but also that, this has happened at a time when these justice institutions are trying to do this huge transformation from a system that's closed door and inquisitorial to one that's open and adversarial, and just ask you or kind of what you thought about whether, the reforms are not promising necessarily more efficiency, and they have, in order to work, they have to have things like plea bargains, otherwise the system's going to get clogged up and not be able to have oral trials for everyone. So I just find it interesting to see, in your global work, do you all find that it's this type of system that a country has, or whether or not that system is corrupt, that matter more? Some things I've read have shown that, you can have an inquisitorial system that works efficiently, but is it protecting rights? I don't know. So that might be the trade-off. But I wanted to thank you very much for having me today, and just thank you for your study. I think it's really interesting. Thanks.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Claire. That's terrific. If I can just pick up on one of the points that Claire was making about the business community. One of the things that we've discovered in our research here at the Wilson Center is, of course, that the private sector plays a key role in generating a response, an effective response to rises in violence in society. And you see the places where it's been successful, where it's been effective. Looking at cities like Tijuana, or in Ciudad Juarez, or in Monterrey, it's largely because the business community lives in the area where the violence is occurring, rather than coming in from outside, and their business and their personal lives are being directly impacted by the violence. And that has generated the momentum for them to get involved and it's not just about opening their checkbooks, it's about making telephone calls, of course, in particular to Mexico City, to make sure that there is a coordinated response. Maureen.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you, Duncan. Thanks to the Mexico Institute and the Institute for Economics and Peace for the invitation. It actually made me also thoroughly read the report, which is difficult sometimes in our busy schedules. I think, to kind of complement what's already been said, I think the report is very important in terms of looking at trends in violence in recent years, with the caveat, obviously, of the cutoff point in terms of how much has changed or hasn't changed since the data was at 2010, up to 2010, how much things have changed in recent years. But also, I think the economic impacts of violence, which isn't something that I think there haven't been that many efforts to really quantify, like what this is costing Mexico in different terms, and how I think the expansion of organized crime in Mexico, or criminal violence, has certainly impacted parts of the country, both due to geography, which I think is very clear looking at the drug route, for example, but also in what other factors come into play in looking at crime and violence. And I think it shows how violence is so different in different parts of the country, and that you can't have a one-size-fits-all policy for the country, which I think has been something that the current government is working on, looking at on policing. For example, with the federal police, they've certainly divided the police into 5 different regions and looking at things from a regional approach in Mexico. I was in Yucatan this summer, and I found it fascinating because there, which is a very safe state, one of the top states, one of their main security concerns is actually illegal fishing and contraband of sea cucumbers, which you would not think of, but it's a big issue, and you see federal police and the Navy and everyone's involved, and it actually can sometimes be violent. But looking at then what are their checkpoints for, and some of it is for detecting sea cucumbers. So how different that is from Morelos or Tamaulipas, where, the main concerns of the population right now are probably more extortion and kidnapping. And so I think that's certainly, just looking at the numbers or where states rank, certainly looks at, well, what are the problems in these areas, and how do you develop policy solutions based on the different unique types of violence or security concerns that different areas have in the country. I found it interesting, you touched on it, Duncan, as well, the correlations and indicators. And I think that whole section is a very useful examination of what are the main things that do appear to influence, a peace indicator or violence in Mexico. And particularly the fact that it would appear, at least in the Mexico case, that incarceration rates and police funding don't have a strong relationship with peacefulness as you might expect. I can say, I think, with our work on policing in Mexico, that looking at federal funding for the states is certainly a useful indicator given how the Mexican government calculates those subsidies. But I think the big challenge in Mexico, and this is for other areas as well, is how that money's spent. And you look at a state like Querétaro, which is certainly ranked as one of the top peaceful states in Mexico, doesn't rank that high for police spending. It's about in the middle. But I think they have had, since 2003, 2004, a very important development of their policing institutions that have more to do with leadership and commitment to doing serious reforms of their police in terms of professionalization. Inigo could speak about this as well. In terms of professionalization, in terms of civil society's role in the police, that it's certainly worth examining and getting more into why just the numbers and the funding part of it doesn't necessarily reflect how these efforts play out on the ground. And certainly, as you mentioned, police corruption as being such an overwhelming problem in Mexico, I think it's much more going down to political will and commitment to do good policing, and not so much how much is being spent, which in oftentimes is not necessarily used for attending to the security needs in a certain area. I think I wanted to just briefly comment on the criminal justice aspect and justice efficiency. You mentioned, and I would agree, that Mexico has the institutional potential to move forward. I think that the challenge there is, you look back, and I lived in Mexico from 2001 to 2006, so it was a more peaceful era. And I think about how often we traveled by road to the beaches in Guerrero or Oaxaca, and areas that right now I would never think about going in my car. And I think we all would like to get back to a part when Mexico was more peaceful and you didn't have that just basic fear of being in different parts of the country or traveling. But it's not just going back to the past, because I think that institutional area is what's key in understanding this, is that Mexico's institutions on police, on justice, have been weak, and they were weak then, and I think that's what has helped foment violence now. The essays that accompany the study, which I think are certainly worth reading, the one that the experts from Mexico Avalúa had done, talk about impunity and how important impunity, the implications impunity has for criminal actions. Because the calculation of the thought that if you're not going to get caught, if the risks for being punished are so low, there's not so much of a disincentive to commit violent acts. And so I think wanting a more peaceful Mexico really means strengthening these institutions and doing it in a way that you're making sure that there is responsible police, that the police have the trust of the population, and that you have a justice system that's actually capable of putting the right people behind bars. And I think that is the other kind of comment I had looking at the indicators here is, I think justice efficiency is certainly an important indicator. Claire kind of touched on this a little bit too, but a kind of concern or caution on just using conviction rates for homicides as the main indicator because of Mexico's history of its justice system. I think the importance of the 2008 reforms of Mexico's criminal justice system are very, very important, and it would be great to see in an updated report kind of how that has played into what's happening in Mexico. I found it fascinating, actually, that the states that are more advanced on implementation, Chihuahua and Morelos, are some of the top states that actually have done the full implementation, are ranked the worst in terms of justice efficiency, whereas the top 5 safest states, only one, which is Yucatan, has actually implemented the reform at all. The other states, Hidalgo, et cetera, haven't even done any efforts to reform their legislation before the federal code was actually passed earlier this year. So it's an interesting where you have states that have actually done a lot to work on their justice system, and that they are not it's not really reflected in terms of how they're ranking right now, partly because they are certainly overwhelmed with high levels of violence and homicides. And I think that's actually been a big challenge in the implementation in states with high levels of violence, is you don't have the space probably needed to do that. But I think also because the 2008 reforms had a very important inclusion in the Mexican Constitution, which is the right to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. And I think in Mexico's history of its justice system, it's been the opposite. And everybody kind of looks at the documentary Presumed Guilty, really reflected the fact that judges, for the most part in Mexico, have been educated to convict people for crimes and prosecutors to convict people. And I think getting to other broader indicators of effectiveness of a justice system really important, given that history and that pressure on like the public awareness of what we want to put people behind bars. And that's not necessarily the right indicators for an effective system, especially given widespread accusations of torture, et cetera, for people that are being accused of crime. I think looking at how the Mexican government with USAID in terms of U.S. support for justice reform have looked at broader indicators of reductions in pretrial detention, as Claire mentioned, the plea bargaining aspects, to some very basic things, which is judges and prosecutors and public defenders actually appearing in hearings, which you wouldn't think is a big deal, but it really is in Mexico. And so I think this is not just the indicators, which I know are very specific numbers, but just to underscore, I think, how important this overhaul of Mexico's justice system will be and how much it's going to reflect longer term in terms of peace in Mexico, because you certainly want to have, I think that the biggest challenge is the rule of law in Mexico. And so having police that can investigate crimes and that present evidence that can stand up in court, and then judges and prosecutors and defenders that are actually doing their job the way that they should. And the other is just to comment briefly on the role of victims in addressing violence in Mexico, victims as a broader like civil society as well. I think there's two main areas of that I wanted to touch on. One was the peace movement and the movement for peace with justice and dignity, which was started by the Mexican poet Javier Cecilia after his son was murdered. And I think the importance of the peace movement to make visible to a lot more Mexicans what was happening in different parts of the country. And kind of when you had these long marches, it was sort of like victims coming out of the woodwork in Mexico of, oh my gosh, there are so many people that have been victims. There are so many disappeared people in our country. And it's really important when you go to a place like Yucatan, where I was speaking to groups there, and it's hard for them to relate to the situation in other parts of Mexico because they don't live it there. And so I think having such wide movements and very public movements were important to visibilize for all of the Mexican population the problems that were happening in different parts of the country. And I think that is still a really pending issue with Mexico, and they do have a victims law, but how do you search for the disappeared? How do you investigate these crimes? The recent numbers would say there are still 22,000 people or more that were disappeared, including about 10,000 during the current government. And the other, I think, is the important role that other organizations that have also been victims of crime have had in pushing for the Mexican government to change policy. And this I would probably put more in the category of victims of kidnapping, and primarily from the business sector. So folks like Alejandro Martí, whose son was kidnapped, and he has the Mexico SOS, to Causa en Común, to México Unido contra la Delincuencia, organizations of victims that have really worked to get a space at the table with the Mexican government and really work to analyze crime. I mean, if you look at Causa en Común, they've done a lot on policing and police accountability in recent years and really pushing back on the Mexican government. And I think there's a certain, that role that they have as, and for protests for victims, because there's certainly widespread protests of victims in different occasions in Mexico, but to do research and advocacy with the Mexican government is very important as that watchdog and counterbalance to the Mexican government's actions. And I think looking at peace have a really important role. I think a really important achievement has been that there are now 5 civil society representatives on the National Public Security Council. And that was an achievement of both the business community, but also a lot of other civil society organizations on, we have something to say about policies in Mexico. And obviously journalists as well, and I think that is another big problem in Mexico, is how do you get to where you have a better flow of freedom of information? And I think where, again, you see organizations, we certainly have the opportunity to work with periodistas de a pie, local group of media who are working to both do great research, but also push back on what has happened and the attacks against them. So I think I will leave it at that. I do think, though, there's a very important study. It will be great to see the updated version and how I think to focus on how violence and how reductions of violence play out in different parts of Mexico, and how Mexico now has that kind of challenge of looking at how do you have the political will to really make sure a lot of these things take place, or the reforms take place to make more progress on peace as we move forward. So thank you.
Thank you. Michelle, I'd like to give you a chance to respond to the comments, but in addition, I'd like to take 3 questions from our audience. For those of you who are watching the webcast, please send in your questions through Twitter using the hashtags that are associated with the event. Who would like to ask a question from the audience or make a comment? Everybody's very shy. Somebody at the back there, please. Can we get a microphone?
Okay, I can just speak up like that. So hi, I'm Andrea. I'm a student at Georgetown University, and I'm a Mexican journalist. So one of the things, Maureen, like I agree very much with what you said about impunity and police. So I always wonder, how can we change that? Like, what would be the right steps? Sometimes we think. Hello, is it better? Okay. Because sometimes we think, well, maybe it's just because policemen have low income, so that's why it's easy to bribe them. But I don't know if you or your institute has, or you have any other examples on how we could change that. Thank you.
Okay, so question for our panel on strengthening of police institutions. Anybody else from our audience today? Please, Eugenio.
I was wondering if the map is very interesting because it kind of shows a big difference between the North and the South. And I would usually think that the North are more competitive, more educated, probably with better institutions to fight organized crime. Have you done any correlation with the distance to the border? Because I think that would be an interesting thing. Because at the same time, while you are taking advantage of being in the close to the United States, trade and everything, you could also kind of receive negative aspects, drug markets, the weapons markets, etc. So.
Thank you. And we have one last question at the back there, sort of right at the back, and then I'll get you in the next round, okay?
So my name is Jessica Soto. I'm with Southern Pulse, and I think that everyone in this room would like to see a peaceful and prosperous Mexico, but I'm curious, and I will look more closely at the report about the methodology for the economic analysis of the costs, because at the end of the day, the entire reason the drug trade exists in Mexico is for an economic benefit at the individual and group level. I mean, probably I've wide-ranging estimates from $20 billion to $60 billion a year going into Mexico from the drug trade, and a lot of that goes into construction, durable goods purchasing, things like that. So when you were talking about the direct costs, a lot of those costs I see recycled within the Mexican economy. So I'm curious if there's any accounting for, you know, one person's loss is another person's gain, basically.
Okay, thank you. Michelle, would you like to kick us off, and then Claire and Maureen can chip in?
Yeah. First of all, thank you both for the comments. And I think that they are particularly helpful because what the Mexico Peace Index is doing is providing such a macro look, and it's not investigating one specific policy, for instance, but that the comments of experts and analysts in the field are really backing up some of the trends that we're seeing data-wise. And I also appreciate the call for continued data collection that we would join the chorus for. It just responding very briefly to some of the points made by the panelists, I agree and would support them all. just to clarify, when we were talking about the data, excuse me, and the lag, we are taking this index from 2003 to 2012. Some indicators data went through 2010, some through 2012. So it's a mix, and that's as up to date as we've had it so far. Clearly, the private sector in Mexico plays a key role. There have been some more academic studies looking at smaller industries and the effect of organized crime on entrepreneurship in some areas in Mexico, particularly coming from Sean Hyatt, who's with Harvard Business School, and is doing also some comparative work looking at Colombia as well. And that's the type of work that we hope to look at more closely moving forward, is looking more closely at the economic impact for various industries, regions, et cetera. Going to some of the questions, I'll leave the first one about how exactly we change the police system to Claire and Maureen and Duncan. I think, back to a comment that Claire made about, is it the type of system or the fact that the system's corrupt? What we've seen from our research is really pointing to, if the system is corrupt, if there's trust in the system. So more than just having, for instance, one type of penal system, it's really about, do citizens feel that there is fairness and efficiency in that process? Distance to the border is something that we haven't looked at specifically. We did do some preliminary analysis comparing, for instance, the Human Development Index around border towns, and seeing a great discrepancy there between cities on one side of the border or the other. Looking at homicide rates, for instance, across the border. But I think that there's a lot more work to be done, and that can be done looking at some of those regional differentiations. And then when we're talking about the economics, obviously there's a huge market for violence, excuse me. And there's a defense industry globally and a violence industry that's extremely profitable. And I do think that the drug trade is a prime example of that. We don't do that one-for-one of looking at which dollar goes where. What we're trying to do really is better understand what all the costs are that are going towards preventing and containing violence, excuse me, in a country. What I can say, though, is that I think if you were to look at all of the money and that is spent on violence as a result, it actually is a tremendous amount. And if you have peace movements and civil society that are increasingly calling for accountability around these areas and for reductions in violence and for increases in feelings of safety, then that can be a tremendous lever. And thank you for pointing that out. Also to say, we have been impacted, and there is a greater impact from the individual level to the institutional level than just what we see of drug barons reaping benefits. And I think, there's a lot more work to be done in this area to look at the economic impact, and the methodology that we've presented is one way of framing it.
All right. Well, just a quick few comments, because I'm not really an expert on police reform, although I would say that you've referred people to other Wilson Center, but Dan Sabet has done a lot on what is worked at the local level, and then Ernesto Portillo and INCIDE in Mexico have done a lot, and some of the things that they talk about are, I think, I read it a while ago, but, certain things like having citizens accountability boards and internal checks, having internal and external accountability, mechanisms within different police forces that are powerful and independent, having like merit-based pay and things that will advance your career for performing well. And then perhaps it seems like some police forces have sought international accreditation. So it may be Querétaro, but certain states have had their police sort of have international experts come and certify them as meeting those standards. And another thing I think people talk about that I remember being at a presentation where someone showed in Tijuana when the different mayors, since there wasn't re-election until recently, I think that should help actually, because different if you're a mayor and you can't be reelected, like what incentive do you have to reform things? I mean, you want to build a road, or you want it because your party will like you, and then maybe you or the people, there's nobody holding you accountable. So I hope that the fact that there will be reelection or will help, have some people who are politicians, their actions will matter more. And there may be some more, if you have people serving and then they are reelected, you won't have, like, for example, they showed the color of the police force, like the car in one, I think it was Tijuana, was white, then it was black, then it was blue, and because each mayor wanted to make it a different color to like show that they were different. And I mean, how confusing is that even for people to know, like, which ones are the police and which ones aren't, which ones are fake, and so, I mean, so that sort of thing might help. But I know Maureen has written a lot more on that than I have, so.
Thanks. I did a report in May, actually looking at police reform in Mexico, and I think overall, in the kind of title was lots of reforms, little progress, and I think there is that clear challenge in Mexico of lots of different attempts to create new police agencies, even as we saw right now with the Gendarmerie, which is now part of the federal police, like a new branch of the federal police. And I think in Mexico's case, it's not necessarily a question of how many police, but good police. And certainly, as Claire touched on, there's areas of recruitment standards, of salaries for police, of how do you have adequate supervision and clear guidelines of who's getting a promotion within police agencies, oversight, both internal and external controls over the police, and how do you have better vetting. So I think my report focused much more on the accountability aspect, and so all the different areas of how do you get stronger controls over the police is probably one of the biggest challenges beyond the need for more training and for more professionalization. But I think it's also, we need to take this as like a longer term challenge in Mexico. You cannot have great policing overnight, and so looking at where Mexico is in these efforts to have more professional police. And certainly with the challenge of Mexico, which is you have a federal police, you have state police, you have municipal police, and so all different levels and different areas. Even I think this report shows being a police in Yucatan is very different than being a police in Chihuahua in terms of the types of risks that you face and in terms of how they model each other. So it's kind of, you can't really think Dan Sabet's report is great because it looks at certain municipal models, but you can't, like, not one size fits all for policing, but it's certainly, again, I think one of the other big challenges in Mexico. So my report's on our webpage, and I know the other ones are, even the Mexico Institute certainly published quite a bit on police and security in Mexico as well.
Thank you. Just a quick footnote here. I think it's extraordinary that over the past 10 years that we've transitioned from talking about the general problem of corruption, the problem of the police, the problem of the judicial system, to actually saying we now need to focus on things like hiring practices, promotion practices. We need to think about police relations with the community, etc. We've actually gone down to a level of specification in the studies, which is incredibly helpful. And it does highlight, I think, that there is this potential to make significant gains in the medium term, all of which, however, require major investments. And not just in terms of money, but in terms of political will, as somebody mentioned earlier on. But this is where you see one of the greatest opportunities for international cooperation on the bilateral level with the United States, but also more broadly with other countries. And it highlights how the expertise and the human capital that exists around the world can be mobilized to actually have an impact upon Mexico. And beyond Mexico, it shows that, I think, what may be possible to do in Mexico could then be taken to Central America and other countries. And that's something that gives me enormous scope for optimism. We have a question towards the back here.
Hi. The question is, in the scope of your research, the idea of a peace indicator, I think it's a very valid attempt. However, the focus has been more on the peace indicator as an opportunity for economic growth in Mexico. I believe Mr. Wood, you even said something to the effect of the business community, the private sector would play a huge role in building peace. But how would the economic funding come and trickle down to the actual comunidades? The map showed Oaxaca and Chiapas as green states. I receive a daily email from Chiapas about assassination, so I would argue that the funding's not coming down. So institutionally, I agree. So where would you see a new shift in terms of how funding receives to the comunidades?
If I can piggyback on that, we had a question coming in through Twitter from Kate Putnam, talking about a coca plant in Chiapas that was discovered. And it's interesting. This is the first time that they've discovered a coca plant in Mexico. And the question is, how do you bolster civil society and institutional capacity in vulnerable southern states? And your question, I mean, it's part of the report, Michelle, I know deals with economic inequality, and that's an important factor. But certainly it's something which we haven't got an adequate response to, and I'm thankful for you for raising that. Do we have another question from the audience before we? Yes, please. If you could introduce yourself, please. Thank you.
I'm Christian Mader with the Aspen Institute. I was just reflecting on the relationship that the U.S. has with Mexico and how it has perhaps contributed to the instability there. I mean, if you look at the issue of firearms that are exported from the U.S., that creates instability. If you look at all the drugs that are imported, which again creates an illicit economy in Mexico. If you look at all the capital outflows from Mexico that sits in American banks, because we keep our banking secrecy laws such that we welcome the money. If you look at how NAFTA has enabled US products, subsidized products to go into Mexico, that has made Mexican products less competitive. If you look at the low-cost labor that has come from Mexico that feeds American industry to a big extent, that we have really created through the big neighbor relationship. There are factors of instability that have not been figured into the pillars of peace here and the role that neighborly states can play to create a more stable economy. And I wonder what would be the prospects of Mexico if some of these externalities had been different in this unusual situation of Mexico. I mean, this is a blessing and a curse to have such a neighbor. But could something be done strategically from a long-term perspective to address some of these fundamental problems of a big neighbor that has influenced Mexico's propensity for peace in a somewhat negative way?
Thank you. Terrific. Michelle.
Thanks. So on the first question about economic inequality, I think the short answer, the point is absolutely valid. The short answer is that is one of the pillars that we're looking at. So we see inequitable distribution of resources, inequality factoring in there. We see it not just amongst income, but also health services, sanitation services, so that there needs to be some sort of economic development and economic equality, and that's true for all countries. Looking at the exogenous large factors and the role of the U.S. and the role of neighborly states, I think that it's difficult to do studies like this and to take into account some of these larger political situations. But something like firearms or drugs, we do see movements coming from civil society, coming from political leadership at a number of levels to try to impact. Whether they will be successful or not remains to be seen, but look at internationally at a presidential level and support for drug reform. I mean, there are areas where there can be coalitions of power that come together that can try to influence some of these larger political factors that clearly have an influence on a country like Mexico and on others.
Thank you so much for your question. I think it's particularly interesting when you just had the Global Commission on Drugs release their report earlier this week, and I was talking to David Shirk yesterday over the phone, and sort of about these issues and sort of what you're talking about in terms of, I mean, since I took over Mexico 5 or 6 years ago, I've started to realize that the people who cover U.S. domestic policies influence the relationship probably more than I, who cover foreign aid to Mexico, because they don't really need, it's a middle-income country, you know, and any amount of money that we gave through the Merida Initiative is important, it is important for the technical assistance and for the symbolic aspect of it, but in terms of what would impact Mexico more would be changes in U.S. domestic policies, you know, weapon issues dealing with weapons, issues dealing with reducing drug demand, and immigration policies, how those change and impact Mexico a whole lot more than sometimes our foreign policy. I think one thing that he said that was very interesting was just the marijuana legalization in the United States, for example, has made marijuana less profitable, and so a lot of the organizations in Mexico are turning to heroin, which then you've seen in the U.S. press. It was more maybe 3 or 4 months ago, but I was getting tons of calls from members of Congress concerned about heroin in their districts from Mexico, and it's because the marijuana is not as profitable, so they switch to heroin, which is more dangerous for us. So, you know, it's really interesting how even liberalization, which people said would help things in Mexico, sometimes the people who were more the pessimists saying that the drug cartels would move to human smuggling. You see the role of the Zetas in the migrant trafficking, or would move to other drugs that may even be more harmful than marijuana, how that's playing out. You know, so it's interesting. I think it's difficult to predict how that will happen, but you do have more and more people arguing to look at drug policy and things like that, and if you want to have an effect on the violence.
And just 2 comments. One briefly, excuse me, on drug policy. I certainly think Mexico is hoping to take a leadership role, or has played in the past, in the UNGAS review, so the review of the global conventions on drug policy, precisely because of what it has experienced, and looking at it as a regional issue. Obviously, Uruguay certainly has interesting experiments, as well as the United States, on marijuana legalization. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But I think the comment on inequality in development, I think, is really important. Looking at Mexico is still, if you look at the OECD countries, still one of, you know, ranks the highest in terms of inequality, and still very high, although they've made some progress in recent years. But I think that overall level of poverty in Mexico that we tend to forget about, because it is certainly, it's a middle-class country, yet you do have large swaths of the population, particularly in southern Mexico, living in very high levels of marginalization. Even states like Guerrero, which is very violent and also has some of the highest levels of poverty. So there are different challenges in different parts of Mexico that are both violent, and then some of the more peaceful states. And just a comment on Oaxaca, too, because it always surprised me in the study that it had so much more progress on peace, because when you look at Oaxaca from a perspective of local conflicts or land tenureship conflicts, it's one of those areas, again, with high levels of marginalization, where you've had, I think they had over 500 local conflicts regarding land tenureship because of all the different permits given to these communities 500 years ago, when they both feel like they've got different parts of territory, but also a lot of conflicts that are rooted in poverty and in feeling that there's not a very effective response from the government to look at longer term development. So it's interesting that even areas that seem to have larger levels of peace, when you look, I talked to someone, he's like, Oaxaca, really? Like, you wouldn't think of Oaxaca being very peaceful because of so many things that aren't necessarily visible in these indicators, including, I think, some of the areas of poverty. So.
Thank you very much. Let me just say a quick word of thanks to my team here at the Mexico Institute, Angela Budzinski, Victoria Dagley, Eugenio Weigand, Pedro Valenzuela, Juanita Islas. As some of you may know, we've gone through a change in team over the summer, so a lot of new faces for you to get to know. Thank you so much to the Institute for Economics and Peace, obviously to Aubrey Fox, to Michelle, To our commentators, Claire and Maureen, thank you so much for being such great partners and friends to us over the years. Please stay tuned. We'll keep the conversation going about Mexico. This week already we've covered questions of innovation and entrepreneurship. We've looked at peace in Mexico. We'll continue with many other interesting issues in the weeks to come. Hope to see you here again soon. Thank you for your attendance.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for hosting.
Good job.
So Claire, I sent
We came in